Comac. I'm a volunteer for the LGBTQIA Heritage Project, and you're all very welcome to today's presentation, to today's History Club. Today we are holding a history jam, and today we have a very lovely range of presenters celebrating different periods and topics of our fabulous LGBT plus history. So first up, we have Joe Walsh, who will show us a video of the Unknown Woman Worker, which is a sculpture by Louise Walsh. Take it away, Joe.
Thanks, Kirsty.
Hi, I'm Siobhan. I'm a volunteer with the LGBT Heritage Project, and I am at Great Northern Mall on Great Victoria Street in Belfast City Centre to share with you one of the places of pride in Northern Ireland's LGBT history. I'm a relatively recent blow into Belfast, having relocated from Cork last year. As such, this place of pride resonates with me because it's a sculpture by Cork-born artist Louise Walsh, who gained her MA in sculpture from the University of Ulster. Louise is a personal friend of mine, and I was delighted to learn about this piece while researching the Women's News archives for the LGBT Heritage Project. So here we have the monument to the Unknown Woman Worker, cast in bronze and standing proud here outside Great Northern Mall since 1992. The piece was commissioned by the Department of the Environment in the late 1980s. Their brief required two colourful, life-size cartoon female figures to reflect the history of the nearby Amelia Street red light district. Louise, the artist, reportedly considered this to be an offensive portrayal of women and instead submitted her proposal for two bronze female figures addressing the underlying issue of low-paid women's work and unpaid housework. You can see her final piece depicts what could be considered a variety of traditionally gendered symbols embedded in the figures. We have telephone, a typewriter to represent low-paid secretarial work, various hairdressing accoutrements for another low-paid occupation, traditionally taken up by women. Then we have, from a housework point of view, shopping basket, baby's bottles, baby's dummies. Also inscribed on the pieces are inscriptions of newspaper articles and headlines in relation to landmark equal pay court cases, as well as some sexist advertising slogans such as, "She's engaged," "She's lovely," "She uses ponds." Louise's design was accepted by the project landscape architect and the Art in Public Places Research Group, but it was opposed by Belfast Development Office and Belfast City Council Parks Committee. It was eventually dropped due to the ongoing disagreement around the interpretation of the scheme. Thankfully, the piece was recommissioned by private developer Glenbank Estates Limited, the owner of Great Northern Mall, in 1992. In her own words, Louise, the artist, regards this commissioned sculpture as a covert dyke piece. Two women connected. This is a striking monument to feminism and women's rights by a renowned lesbian artist, and I applaud her bold stance in the face of artistic ignorance from the bureaucracy of the time. Well deserves a mention in our places of pride.
So that was a Places of Pride piece. We're going to intersperse the presentations with these wee videos just to give, it's because tonight is History Jam. So just to give you a wee bits of flavour of different presentations and different parts of our archive and our visual archive and audio archive. Okay, so trans life in Ireland, past and present. Okay, so the question is, when did trans people start existing? When did we invent them, so to speak? And we've got a few periods of history here. So does anybody want to take a guess when they think there's information recorded of trans people? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It's probably earlier than you think. So it does go right back, the recording of trans history. And as the documentary is titled, "We Were Always Here," it also applies to our trans community. So the earliest records that I have here go back to 3000 BC with the Sumerian Gala priests. And they were priests who were assigned male at birth, but they served the goddess Inanna in feminine roles. And back as far as 1500 BC, we have the Hijra community in South Asia, and they are recognized in ancient Hindu texts such as the Karma Sutra. Hijras are known as the third gender, and they have spiritual and social roles. And 500 BC, we have records of two-spirit people in indigenous North America, and many tribes recognized individuals with both masculine and feminine spirits. And even 200 BC, the Roman Emperor Elga, I'm probably going to have a few takes at this, the Roman Emperor Elgabalus reportedly identified as female and sought gender-affirming procedures. So that's the ancient and pre-colonial era. The medieval period, between the 8th and 13th century, we have the Mukhan Athun in the Islamic world, and they were gender non-conforming individuals with feminine traits and roles. And in the 1600s, we have the Wakashu in Edo, Japan, and they were young males with androgynous presentation, distinct from adult men and women. Okay, so they're maybe not trans as we would know trans today, but there certainly were records of gender non-conformity and gender fluidity. So 19th onto the 19th and early 20th century, we have in the 1860s, Chevalier d'Eon in France, a diplomat and a soldier who lived publicly as a woman for decades. 1910, the Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science in Germany, and that was early research and advocacy for trans and queer identities. And we have Lawrence Michael Dillon, who we're going to come on to in the next slide. I'll give you more information on Lawrence Michael Dillon. He's a bit more local, and this is the first trans man known to undergo phalloplasty, or as we would call it, bottom surgery. And then 1930, Lily Elbe in Denmark, one of the first known recipients of gender-affirming surgery. So fascinating trans history so far, and in the mid to late 20th century, our more recent history, we have in 1952, Christine Jorgensen in the USA became widely known after gender-affirming surgery in Denmark. 1966, we have the Compton's cafeteria riot in San Francisco, which preceded the 1969 Stonewall riots, where trans women and drag queens resisted police harassment. And then the famous trans women from the Stonewall riots have Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, you may have heard of from some of our historic texts and stories. There is a bit of controversy, I have to say, around the Marsha P. Johnson not describing herself as trans, but it's simply the language of transgender wasn't used at that time. So Marsha P. couldn't have described herself as trans woman because the language simply wasn't used at that stage. So but she certainly is reported to have used she, her pronouns. And then 1972, Sweden was one of the first countries to legalize gender-affirming surgery. So that's when trans people started existing. They've always been here, like the rest of us. 21st century, I have to mention the 2004 Gender Recognition Act in the UK was enacted, which allowed trans people to change their legal gender. Then that happened. That followed. Ireland followed in 2015 with their Gender Recognition Act, but theirs included self-identification, self-ID, or self-declaration, and that meant that people could change gender without medical intervention. And in 2021, Elliot Page comes out as trans, non-binary person, so that's a more local person, and that was a major moment for visibility in global media for trans people. And then just ongoing global activism and legal reforms. So then on to Lawrence Michael Dillon, who was born in 1915. So in Lawrence's early life, Lawrence was born as Laura Maud Dillon in Kensington, England. He was assigned female at birth, but never identified as a girl. After his mother died shortly after his birth and his father, In 1925, Dylan and his brother were raised by their aunts in Folkestone. He studied at St Anne's College, Oxford, where he excelled in rowing and became president of the Women's Boat Club. He graduated in 1938 with a degree in theology. So, the medical transition and contributions. In 1939, Lawrence was aged 24 and began taking testosterone, which was inspired by early research on hormone therapy. He underwent a double mastectomy, as we would know it today as top surgery, and later a series of phalloplasty surgeries. We would call that bottom surgery. And he went through those surgeries between 1945 and 1949. Those surgeries were performed by Sir Harold Gillet. He enrolled in Trinity College Dublin to study medicine and later performed an orchiectomy on Roberta Cowell, who was the first British trans woman to undergo gender affirming surgery. So lots of firsts, lots of landmark history making things here from Lawrence. And Lawrence actually wrote a book in 1946 called Self, and it was a study in ethics and endocrinology, and it's considered a pioneering work in transgender medicine and ethics. And he also wrote another book which was published posthumously, exploring both physical and spiritual transformation, and it was called Out of the Ordinary. And that was a manuscript that was recovered and published after he had died. And he had a bit of aristocracy in his background, so also a bit of public scrutiny that followed that. So in 1953, he requested that the Derberts and Burkes peerage, and they are, you might be saying, what the hell is that? It's not easy to say. That's two long established British publications that document the genealogy and titles of the aristocracy and landed gentry. So he requested that they update his listing to reflect his identity, acknowledging him as the heir to the Dillon of Lismullen baronetcy. So he was an heir as a baron. And why did they matter so much in Lawrence Michael Dillon's story? Well, to update these entries in those publications at the time was very bold and public affirmation of his gender identity. And these books were considered and still are considered very authoritative records of aristocratic status. So his inclusion as the heir under his correct name and gender was a significant movement in trans visibility and recognition within British elite society. However, there was a downside to this because the public recognition led to media scrutiny and outed him publicly, which deeply affected him. So, to get away from that, he in 1958 moved to India, seeking refuge away from the public attention, and he embraced Buddhism. And he was ordained as a monk under the name Losbang Yavanka, becoming the first white European man ordained in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Fascinating. And then he died in Dalhousie, India, in May 1962 at the age of 47. So quite a young age to die, and quite a lot packed into his life, and what a legacy to leave behind. A very brave person at that time, if you can imagine the stigma that's still around now today for trans people, but back then, born in 1915, it must have been incredibly a brave thing to do. So Dylan's legacy, his life intersected medicines, ethics, spirituality, gender identity in very profound ways. His transition predated Christine Jorgensen's by a decade and remains a landmark in trans history. And he is commemorated in exhibitions, scholarly works, and LGBTQIA plus history projects hello, such as ours, uh, for his courage and contributions. Okay, so I'm going to briefly tell you a wee bit about our next trans person, who is Wilma Creeth. Just to bullet point the facts are about Wilma. So Wilma is widely regarded as one of the first known trans women in the north of Ireland to undergo gender confirmation surgery. And there was a play celebrating Wilma's life recently within the last 12 months at the Arts Festival last year. I don't know if any of you went to see that. She had gender confirmation surgery in Leeds in 1980, and she travelled to Leeds for surgery because it wasn't available here in the north of Ireland. And sadly, Wilma died 3 days later due to pulmonary embolism, which is a complication linked to estrogen therapy. And possibly that is also because she had to travel for the surgery and wasn't able to receive it locally. So there may not have been adequate aftercare. Wilma had a fascinating background. She was a bus driver on the Belfast to Bangor route. She was very fondly remembered by passengers and people who knew her from back then. She initially drove as Bill and later transitioned while working for Ulsterbus stroke City Bus, as it was known in them days. She had a lot of support from the managing director of Ulsterbus and City Bus. His name was Werner Heubeck, and he offered her a job after she did some electrical work at his home. And he ensured that she had a custom uniform and shoes and supported her transition within the company. And that story is part of our walking tour, which Jude tells in great detail and has a fascinating amount of detail to Wilma's story. So if you want to know more about Wilma, come along, book yourselves in for a wee walking tour, and you will find out a lot more. It's a real honour to hear about Wilma. And one of the major things about Wilma is that she helped in the early days of Cara Friend, the helpline. Wilma helped establish a trans-specific support line and befriending group through Cara Friend. And the line operated on Thursday evenings and was staffed by trans volunteers. It received 142 contacts in its first year, and the service unfortunately folded after Wilma's death, and that just highlights the central role that Wilma had. Not everybody is replaceable. So where does that leave us today in terms of trans history and our trans community? So trans and intersex people have always been part of Irish society, in fact, the worldwide society. But in here in Ireland, they've always been supported by individuals who have helped with name changes, medical care, workplace inclusion, privacy, and safety. And today, trans people face challenges including limited access to healthcare, lack of family or community support, and high rates of discrimination and harassment. We're currently facing huge backlash against the trans community. On the island of Ireland, trans healthcare is partitioned, so it's different in both jurisdictions and very difficult to access in both jurisdictions. An Irish identifying person from the north cannot use a Southern Gender Recognition Certificate to update their birth certificate, and they must rely on British systems. So there's national identity issues there as well to make things more complicated. So to say the least, trans life in Ireland is very complex and is shaped by our legal, medical, and cultural boundaries and barriers, just like other identities that people may live with. Okay, so before we come on to that's the end of my presentation. And before we come on to the next presentation by Megan, I'm going to let you watch a wee YouTube video.
I'm Elsa, the volunteer with the LGBT Heritage Project, and I'm here to talk about the cathedral buildings behind me and the activities going on in the 1990s. We're on Lower Donegal Street in Belfast, and here in the early 1990s, a number of LGBT plus grassroots groups were running services in these buildings, including Cara Friend and Lesbian Line. In 1995 to 6, Cara Friend would host their 1 in 10 youth club meetings for LGBT 17 to 25-year-olds here in the cathedral buildings. According to an ad in Women's News, the club would have regular meetings. They would invite speakers, organise social outings and weekend trips. 1 in 10 also issued a small magazine around this time, GLAD, Gay and Lesbians Against Discrimination, in conjunction with the Youth Against Sectarianism groups in the 1990s. Also in 1995, there was an interesting moment of groups lobbying together to set up a lesbian campaign and information group in Belfast. A conference first took place on the 29th of October with representatives from Lesbians Organising Together, LOT, and Lesbian Line in order to go about doing this. The backdrop to setting up this group was a bill that was issued in England to change the age of consent to 18 for gay men. The passing of this bill was controversial, and it highlighted the different positions that lesbian women were in. As was written in Women's News in 1995, the situation for lesbians in Northern Ireland at this time is very vague, to say the least. Women needed to know what their legal rights were in regards to child custody, housing, and employer discrimination on the basis of sexuality. Whilst up until now, Lesbian Line could refer individuals that called to different solicitors, it was clear that they couldn't do all the work. It wasn't feasible, and so they had to work together with other groups. Groups at this time were recognising the need for a wider context of lesbian action in the city of Belfast and the need for Lesbian Line and other groups to work together. It's great to look back at these cathedral buildings and think of all the incredible work being done here by numerous LGBT plus grassroots organisations. Their cooperation, working together to help local citizens and fight injustices in Belfast, is definitely something to look back on and be proud during this Pride Week in 2020.
Yeah, so our next speaker then is Megan Donnelly, who will be talking to us about LGBTQIA plus history in the 2010s. Please take it away, Megan.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'll just give you a wee indication whenever we're changing slides. So yeah, I'm Megan. I'm one of the volunteers with the project, and I'm going to look at LGBTQIA plus history in the 2010s through the themes of progress, people, places, and protest. I think when we think about history, we often think about things that were a long time ago, but it's really important, especially within the queer community, to be recording history as it happens, because it makes it that much harder then to raise. And it's really important that it's history that's being wrote by us ourselves, not just by those who are maybe against us, rather with us. So if you could, next slide. Yeah, so starting off on the theme of progress, the 2010s saw a lot of legislative change coming on the back of large-scale and hard-fought campaigns. So starting it off, after high cases at the High Court, the Supreme Court, attempted repeal by Edwin Poots, was the health minister at the time. In 2013, it was ruled that Northern Ireland's ban on adoption by same-sex couples was discriminatory. This led to it being overturned, with couples being given the same adoption rights as prospective same-sex parents in the rest of Britain. 2013 was also the year that David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, posthumously gave a pardon to Alan Turing, the World War II codebreaker who was convicted of homosexual acts. And this set off a campaign that led to the passing of the so-called Turing Law in 2016 that gave the same pardon to all men convicted under anti-gay laws and allowed living men to apply to have their convictions overturned. That same year, Stormont voted to extend the law to Northern Ireland. And although there's been some criticism about how the historical convictions for living men have been handled, it was really important acknowledgement of the legal injustices faced by gay and bisexual men. Then in 2014, England and Wales brought in legislation to legalise same-sex marriage, but that didn't extend to Northern Ireland. The first motion in favour of equal marriage was brought to Stormont in 2012, but failed to get the majority of MLA support. There's then 5 more debates between 2012 and 2015 on the subject, and a majority was finally achieved in the last debate. However, the DUP, who opposed equal marriage, decided to use a petition of concern that would block any further progress on the matter, and this remained in place for 5 years. This was despite growing momentum for the Love Equality campaign put together by the Rainbow Project, Cara Friend, Here and I, Amnesty International, the trade unions. And also after the marriage referendum down south in 2015 that brought equal marriage into effect there, we then had, as Joe referenced, this partition situation where couples could be married south of the border but not here. Eventually, Stormont does what Stormont does and collapsed, which created an opportunity for MPs in Westminster to bring forward legislation that would bring Northern Ireland into line. So that passed in 2019, and the first same-sex marriages took place in February the following year. And lastly, just to mention that in 2016, when Michelle O'Neill was the Health Secretary, she announced that Northern Ireland would also come into line with the rest of Britain in removing the ban on men who have sex with men donating blood. This was something the Rainbow Project had been campaigning on for a long time. Initially, the change still required men to have a waiting period of a year before donating, which was later reduced to 3 months and then removed entirely in 2021. And the Rainbow Project continued advising on moving towards a more holistic, individualised donation system. So next slide, and if you want to just bring up all the photos. So, of course, to have these legislative changes, it's really helped by having people in the spaces where those decision makings are being made. And the 2010s saw a lot of LGBT individuals elected to political offices for the first time. So in 2010, we had the first out civic councillor in Belfast, Mary Ellen Campbell, who also brought in motions in support of equal marriage to the council chambers. And in 2017, began the process of having the beautiful LGBT history window that you can now see on show in City Hall. Before he was the first openly gay cabinet member in Stormont, Andrew Moore of Alliance was also the first gay mayor on the island. He was elected in 2013 in North Down. John Blair became the first openly gay MLA in Stormont when he took up the South Antrim seat in 2018. And in 2016, Ellen Murray made history as both the first transgender candidate to run for election in Northern Ireland and the first Green Party candidate for West Belfast. And then south of the border, 2017 saw Leo Varadkar elected as Taoiseach, and he was the first openly gay man to hold the office. But representation applies not just to politics, so turning towards culture, which is really influential in bringing visibility to our community and celebrating it. 2014 saw the release of Pride, film based on the true story of lesbians and gays support the Miners, a group founded by Mark Ashton, who was born in Portrush. And we also saw drag kind of coming into the mainstream in the 2010s, I think in large part due to things like RuPaul's Drag Race, and the first UK version of the show in 2019 featured Blue Hydrangea from Belfast. So there was also an opportunity to reflect on historical queer figures in our queer heritage with the Decade of Centenaries or Anniversaries, which began in 2012. This was sort of a movement across the island of Ireland, marking the period from the Home Rule era to Irish independence partition in the Civil War. There was big effort by organisers and academics to emphasise shared history, particularly in reference to looking at Protestant, Catholic, Unionist, nationalist communities. But queer and feminist academics helped draw attention to significant figures involved in the revolution, such as Kathleen Lynn, Madeline French-Mullen, Margaret Skinner, and Roger Casement. And Casement was given a ceremony to mark 100 years since his execution, which you can see in the lower photograph. So something that we've seen throughout queer history is how important it is to have our own spaces, and 2010s was no exception to that. So the Lesbian Advocacy Service Initiative, or LASSI as it was known, changed names in 2012 to become Here NI, which was to emphasise the inclusion of all LGBTQIA+ women and non-binary people. The Belfast Trans Resource Centre opened in 2016. It's a space run by and for trans people to provide community support and social space, and it's become increasingly important in these sadly growing hostile times. It was also the opening of the 343 in 2019 by a queer feminist art collective on the Newton Arch Road, of all places, in part as a response to the DUP minister's criticism of drag story time at the local library. This was an attempt to sort of use art and performance as resistance. And in a similar vein, you can see a photo here from a 2017 BBC interview about drag nights in Portrush, showing how local queer community looked to celebrate their existence even in small towns. And this was part of a growing rural pride scene, which you can see on the next slide. Yep. So in 2012, we had the first Newry Pride, and Mid Ulster Pride was founded in 2019. There was also the first Trans and Intersex Pride in 2018. It was held prior to Marriage Equality March, and the event continues, playing a role in calling out harmful legislation and transphobia, as well as providing a safe space for joy and celebration. Next slide. So one of my favourite quotes comes from Frederick Douglass, and it's that without struggle, there's no hope. And changes that came about in the 2010s come from hard campaigning and persistence. Yeah, so nothing, I think, sums up persistence quite like what's often called the gay cake case. So in 2014, Asher's Bakery refused to make a cake with the message to support gay marriage, claiming that this would be against their religious beliefs. The Equality Commission declared that this would be discriminatory. In response, the DUP looked to introduce a conscientiousness clause to equality legislation, allowing people to opt out of providing services to queer people if it went against their beliefs. So despite a Belfast court ruling against the bakery, there was subsequent appeals, and the case eventually went to the UK Supreme Court. But what was really significant was, in response to the DUP's proposed changes to the legislation, people came out onto the streets in support of holding up LGBT rights. And people certainly also came out for marriage equality, with thousands marching in 2015, 2017 and 2019. And what was really important, I think, with this is that it wasn't just LGBT plus groups marching, but organisations from across public life, with unions, political groups, religious organisations, charities, students and allies, as well as queer people joining together in a sense of solidarity. And this was repeated in marches for abortion rights, where queer activists stood alongside others to call for access determinations, and also played a role in highlighting the necessity for abortions for all people of all genders and sexualities. And then in 2017, when the Conservatives made their post-election deal with the DUP, activists from Northern Irish queer groups helped to bring attention to the party's discriminatory record and harmful beliefs, and supported protests across the UK in response to that deal. And then one of my favourite examples, just because it reminds me of some of the themes that you see in the Pride film, this sense of solidarity between workers and queer activists on show during the occupation of Harland and Wolff in 2019, where shipyard workers seeking to save their jobs You can see the Pride flag being flown at the yard's gates and t-shirts made by Queer Space for Pride that year. And although the 2010s also saw the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which was a difficult moment, mainstreaming transphobia, queerphobia, and racism, which we know has only gotten worse, we saw resistance to his rhetoric and the migration bans, with people again coming out onto the streets and queer people continuing to be present in anti-racism rallies, as well as leading resistance to the more recent puberty blocker bans and playing a role in campaigns around domestic violence. So that's, the 2010s told through themes of progress, people, places, and protests. And I'm going to end with someone who I think captures both the hope and progress of the era, as well as some of the challenges and uncertainties. So Lyra McKee was a journalist and queer activist shot during riots in Derry in 2019. People came out for vigils, and her words, which she wrote in a letter to her 14-year-old self, "It won't always be like this, it's going to get better," has become a source of hope and inspiration for multiple communities across Northern Ireland. So that's
Thank you so much, Megan. Like, well done. That was such a lovely presentation, very enlightening. Thank you again. And so up next we have Joe, who's going to tell us about the Gay Christian Fellowship.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'm just going to share another wee video here from our YouTube archive.
I'm Megan Donnelly, and I'm the volunteer with the LGBT Heritage Project. I brought us here to number 8, Upper Crescent in Belfast, for the Places of Pride project for Belfast Pride. And the reason I brought us here is because this was the home of the Gay Christian Fellowship in the 1980s and 1990s. The Gay Christian Fellowship, GCF, was established as the Northern Ireland Council on Religion and Homosexuality in 1976, but it was better known as the Gay Christian Fellowship. And this was a group that met together in a safe space in Belfast for discussion, for social activities, for retreats as well. It's a safe space for gay Christians to come into the city centre. A number of significant individuals were involved here. One of whom was actually involved in the Corrymeela community. This was actually the home of the Corrymeela community between 1971 and 2014. And the Corrymeela community is a Christian community that promotes peace and reconciliation. That individual was Sylvia Sands. She was a peace and community worker in Belfast at the time, and she was actually a straight ally of gay Christians, and she was one of the early chairpersons of the GCF. The Reverend Mervyn Kingston, who was the Church of Ireland clergyman, and his partner Richard O'Leary, who is the coordinator of the LGBT Heritage Project, were also involved, as well as a number of other individuals. Many of these people were not out because they were gay and Christian, and many of them we don't know their names. But this group was also significant because it included Catholics, Protestants, which I guess was quite unusual for the period of the Troubles. But even though we don't know who many of these individuals were, this was very much an underground meeting. These were people who did contribute significantly to gay life in Belfast, and so we remember them today.
Well, that's the end of our History Jam, folks. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you also to our wonderful speakers today who gave us such enlightening and such wonderful presentations. So I'm just going to open the floor here to see if there's any questions from our speakers or any questions for the speakers. Please feel free to raise your hand, or please feel free to put a wee message in the chat. I'm just going to see. Yes, I remember you putting this message in the chat. It was in reference to what Joe was saying about trans and non-conforming people existing. A said maybe we could find trans people in cave art and stuff like that. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if we could. Yeah, that's a very interesting thing to say.
Yep.
Any questions, folks?
There's another wee comment in the chat, Kirsty.
Oh yes, Gareth says, "Thank you everyone, great range in history." Thanks for coming along, Gareth. Thank you so much.